Welcome, everyone. My name is Marcia Marley. I'm president of Succeed Together. Thank you for joining us for the 4th annual festival sponsored by Succeed Together. I hope you have been able to view several of today's terrific sessions, and we still have another event this afternoon and 2 outstanding sessions tomorrow. The festival is a program of Succeed Together, a nonprofit that provides free educational services to low-income children in Essex County. If you'd like to support the tutoring and enrichment programming, you can donate via the link in the chat. The need for S2G's programming has never been greater than during this pandemic, so please consider donating to help close the achievement gap in Essex County. Today's books are available for purchase through festival partner Watchung Booksellers. You can click on the bottom of the button of your the button at the bottom of your screen, to buy them. The green teal button there right below me. All our authors appear for free, so please thank them by buying their books. If you have a question for today's speakers, you can click on the Ask a Question bar on the bottom right of your screen rather than in the chat box. It is now my great pleasure to introduce my friend and neighbor, Kate Zernike, the moderator of this session on politics 2020 and the future of American politics and our world and our democracy, etc. The last part I added, because I have a hard time mentioning this election without being apocalyptic, to say the least. Kate Zernike, though, is someone to calm me down usually. She has been a reporter for the New York Times since 2000 and was a member of the team that shared the 2002 Pulitzer Prize for explanatory reporting. She is the author of Boiling Mad, Behind the Lines in Tea Party America, published in 2010, and is currently writing a book about women in science that I am looking forward to reading. Kate, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon.
Thanks, Marcia, and thanks for this great event. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. This should be really fun. It's obviously a hot topic. We have, I believe it's 7 Tuesdays before Election Day. And I'm not sure we're going to be able to we're trying to get out of the prediction business in this panel, but I'm sure you're all going to have questions, so we'll try to answer all of them. Please do answer your question, ask your questions where it says ask a question on your screen or in the chat box. And also please do buy the author's books by clicking the button below. We have a fantastic partner in Watchung Booksellers, and it would be great to support not only the bookstore, but also these authors with their terrific books. Joining me is Montclair's own Charlotte Alter, Montclair native. She is also a national correspondent for Time magazine. She covers elections, women in politics, and the rise of the grassroots left. Her work has also appeared in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. The ones we've been waiting for is her first book. Welcome, Charlotte. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Thanks, Kate.
Julie Hirschfeld Davis is my colleague in the Washington Bureau of the New York Times. She is the congressional editor and deputy Washington editor at the Times. She's covered politics and policy from Washington for 2 decades, including 3 presidential campaigns, 3 presidents, and many, many sessions of Congress, which means many late nights. She was previously a White House correspondent for the Times and has also worked at Bloomberg, the Associated Press, the Baltimore Sun, and Congressional Quarterly. And Julie is the co-author with our colleague Michael Shear of Border Wars Inside Trump's Assault on Immigration. So again, thank you for joining us, Julie, both of you. It's great to have you.
Great to be with you.
Thanks. I'm going to start with you, Julie. These books really, both of these books are I don't want to say they're bookends to our politics, but they really do. These are both just sort of really detailed, fast-paced accounts of what's happening with our 2 major parties. Charlotte, your book on the left, and Julie on the right. Just to sort of set us up kind of chronologically, Julie, I'm going to start with you. Your book talks about, you start with Stephen Miller and Steve Bannon sort of setting the stage for this candidate. They weren't even sure who it was going to be. They just knew their issue was going to be immigration. They luck upon Donald Trump, who sort of stumbles into this line about build the wall almost unintentionally. He uses that to win election to everyone's surprise, including his own. And then once he's in office, that kind of his immigration policy or what he said on immigration and really the way he won election kind of gets in the way of his own success, right? Because he finds that he can't get these things done, the things that he's been talking about on the campaign trail. And I was just struck reading your book about how much has happened. I mean, at some point I came across the name Paul Ryan in your book and I was like, oh yeah, Paul Ryan, that was ages ago. But can you catch us up and sort of tell us, given everything that's happened in the last several years, where are we now in terms of the way Trump is running his campaign? Is he still working the immigration theme for re-election? And is that going to work this time?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's important to understand what brought Donald Trump to immigration in the first place, and then we can sort of fast forward and understand a little bit better why he's running his campaign the way he is now. Mm-hmm. So immigration for Trump, I mean, you allude to Stephen Miller and Steve Bannon, and we talk in the book about this dinner that they had in 2013 with Jeff Sessions, who was then a senator from Alabama, who became Trump's attorney general later. Where they're talking about, we really need to run a candidate who is going to make this appeal to white working class voters, this populist appeal that's going to sort of be centered around, that immigration is harmful to this country, that trade is bad. This was 180 degrees on the opposite of what the rest of the Republican Party was at that time thinking. You mentioned Paul Ryan. He and Mitt Romney had just lost the election, and there was all this soul searching among Republicans. Why did we lose? And the vast consensus among Republicans was that they lost because their tent had been too narrow, because they had not, appealed to independent voters who cared about, issues like immigration, thought that they were a net positive. They hadn't reached out to Hispanic voters. They hadn't done any of those things. And these three guys are on the totally other side of the spectrum saying, no, the reason that Mitt Romney lost is because people thought he was an elitist. People thought he was a globalist. And if we as a party, we Republicans want to win elections in the future, we need to focus on those people. And so that's kind of that was the theory of the case. And Trump, we talk about in the book, he's neither a detailed political theorist nor a detailed policy guy. He's not really thinking in these terms. But for him, immigration was two things. One was a way to sort of jolt voters and energize them and scare them into a lot of really sort of intense support for him. He found that when he talked about the wall and the dangers of immigration and the dangers of all these people who don't look and sound like us in our communities, that really energized people. So because he is a person who sort of thrives on the crowd and thrives on that kind of feedback loop, that was one reason that he found immigration to be a really helpful theme for him. The other aspect of this that I think is really important to understand is that this was sort of a proxy issue for Trump. This was a way of sort of messaging to voters that I'm not like these other politicians who are going to be polite and speak in the ways that you've heard politicians speak for decades about, the importance of the economy and the importance of inclusiveness and all of that. I don't care about any of that. I'm going to tell you what I really think. And that's sort of who I am as a candidate. And I think for him, immigration became sort of the messaging tactic of that approach. And people did gravitate to that. Republicans and conservatives really grabbed onto that, and he found that to be very useful. So now fast forward to 2020, we saw him do it in 2018 when, as you recall, he talked about the caravan and the dangers of immigrants coming up north from, through Mexico from Central America. And now we're hearing this message of law and order, and I'm the only one who can keep you safe. It's the same appeal to like fear, and your communities are not what you remember and what you want them to be. And if you feel disaffected, if you feel uncomfortable and displaced, you have someone to blame. And I'm the only person who's going to really tell you the truth about that. And so that's, I think, the arc that we can see that connects 2016 and the 2018 midterm elections and this election. It's all the same message, which is a very kind of fear-centric approach to really get people to say, I might be concerned about this policy issue or that policy issue, but in the end, I am really scared of all the things that Trump is talking about. And he's the only one who's really talking about it in that way. And so I feel I identify with that. And so I think that that is a lot of what we're seeing right now. And a lot of Republicans who are running in races around the country have sort of shrunk from that because they understand that that is, you know, if we look at any of the polls or you know, even anecdotally, when you talk to voters, that is not necessarily resonating with people's concerns right now in mid a pandemic and a recession and all the rest. But for a certain segment of voters, it is incredibly important. And no matter, and taking out every other factor, that is going to be determinative for them.
Right. So Charlotte, I want to move to you, or just bring you in. Julie mentioned the caravan and how Donald Trump tried to play that as an issue in 2018. And we talked about this a little bit in the warm up to our conversation, but you know, you write about the rise of the left, right? And you talk about this sort of double helix strand of, you know, there's a Pete Buttigieg sort of more moderate, young Democratic left, and then there's the AOC, as Trump would call it, radical left. It strikes me that Trump is trying to play the radical left the same way he tried to play the caravan in 2018. It didn't work in 2018 to play the caravan. It turned out, I think, Julie, you would acknowledge that polls showed that voters actually didn't work for them, and it backfired against Republicans. But is Trump, how is the sort of anti-radical left message working for him? You've been talking to a lot of voters in the Midwest. What are you hearing?
I think it's actually working pretty well for him. I'm hearing a lot of anxiety from, frankly, older white voters who think that that Joe Biden is a socialist and that that he's coming to get them. You know, one of the things that I kind of try to unpack in this book is how the idea of socialism has sort of two different meanings depending on kind of how old you are. You have a lot of people who are baby boomers or older who remember the Cold War, who remember the Soviet Union and the Red Menace and the Iron Curtain. And when they think of socialism, they think of like waiting in line at a gulag with like, you know, like waiting for bread, you know, having your eyeglasses stolen from you and stomped in the mud, like all of the images of sort of, you know, horrifying 20th century totalitarian communism. And I think when a lot of young people think of socialism, they think of Sweden, where everyone has healthcare and there's free childcare and you can take your kid to like a 24-hour childcare center. One of the things that at least I've been seeing in the last couple of weeks is that the former group, the people who think of socialism as and equate it with totalitarian communism, those are the people who live in these, often the people who live in these states that are going to decide the election. You know, young socialists in Brooklyn and San Francisco are not, you know, they might have a totally different interpretation of what 21st century socialism means, but ultimately in this election, that is not going to be, those votes and that perception is not going to be as decisive as this sort of fear of socialism. So I definitely think it's working from the conversations I'm having. I mean, I know that Joe Biden is, again, I'm not in the prediction business, but that message is certainly resonating.
Right.
I would just say, you know, just to interject on that, you know, we, as you know, Kate, have a poll out today that the Times did with Siena College, which really sort of underscores what Charlotte just said, which is that, I mean, the poll does show that Biden is leading Trump in some of these key battleground states, including some of the ones where Charlotte has been reporting, and he's still ahead, but his lead has tightened. And you can, if you look at the crosstabs, you can really see that this law and order message is resonating in particular with older voters, with voters over 65. And it is, again, you know, just to go back to the immigration theme, it's about fear. It's about, you know, fear of the unknown and also fear of the known. And so I think that I totally agree with that assessment, that it is, you know, there isn't necessarily evidence that he's winning on it yet, but he's certainly made inroads with it, and it's something that will definitely have a major influence, I think.
Yeah, I want to raise 2 points just because I think they're important. One is, Julie, maybe since you've covered both the White House and Congress, you can address this, but I think it's really important to remind people the difference between a midterm election electorate and a presidential electorate, right? So I think a lot of people look at 2018 and think like, oh, look, Democrats won. We're in a Democratic wave. It's, Trump will be voted out of office. You and I know it's different, right? The electorate is very different voting in a presidential election. Generally, that tends to benefit the sort of the older white vote doesn't matter as much. But it seems like in many ways, all bets are off with this. But can you talk about that a little bit? And also, talk about how Democrats did win. It wasn't necessarily all of these way left Democrats who won in 2018. Can you talk about that a bit?
Right. Yeah. So, when we think about the 2018 midterm elections and what allowed the Democrats to win the House, we think of names like AOC and Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib from Michigan, and all of these kind of this new sort of vanguard of very progressive, oftentimes women, many of them women of color, who really represent sort of a new generation of Democratic lawyer who's in Congress, and they're having a real influence. And there's no question that they have changed the complexion. They've really changed, I think, the emphasis in many ways of the Democrats on Capitol Hill. And without them, of course, the Democrats wouldn't be in control. But, they, by and large, won Democratic seats. All of them won Democratic seats. They were progressive candidates who defeated less progressive candidates, but still Democrats. In urban or liberal places that were always going to be Democratic seats. The reason that Democrats won in 2018 were really because they won in these marginal districts, which in many cases Trump had won in 2016, Clinton had lost, and they have sort of conservative leaning electorates. But there are a lot of independents, and they have a lot of leaners. And many of them are suburban places where issues like immigration and some of these cultural issues and these very raw appeals that Trump was making just really did not resonate with voters. They tend to be sort of socially more middle of the road. They're maybe economically more conservative, but what they really want is some pragmatic leadership. And in those places, Democrats won and Republicans lost in 2018. And that is what gave Democrats control of the House. So we've seen this really interesting push-pull in this first session of the Congress where, the critical mass of leaders among Democrats are seen as these progressives. And we hear Trump talk about AOC and Ilhan Omar all the time. They're sort of the brand, but the real sort of engine of the majority is these more centrist members. And so Speaker Pelosi and the Democratic leaders have really had to try to triangulate between those two poles and sort of steer a middle course. And of course, if you look at what happened in the presidential primary, it was a lot the same situation. You had a lot of energy on the left. Of course, that is what is going to drive what happens in November. But the person who actually ended up getting the nomination is Joe Biden, who is very much an establishment Democrat, very much a mainstream Democrat. He calls himself a progressive, and if you look at some of his policies, he certainly is. But he's not a person who is aligned with this sort of new left that we talk about when we talk about the new generation of Democratic leaders. In terms of the electorate and what it looks like, I think one of the things that really helped Democrats in 2018 is they poured a lot of energy and, frankly, money into juicing intensity among Democrats and getting out more of the electorate than typically comes out in a midterm election. And they did a better job of that than Republicans did. But with Donald Trump at the top of the ticket and on the ballot again, they're not going to have that advantage. Republicans, I think, will be very energized. Part of the law and order argument that we're hearing from Trump is designed to sort of juice that even more. Right. And while I think that Democrats will also be very energized given everything that's going on, it's going to look a lot different. They're going to have to contend with a lot of intensity on the right, along with a lot of intensity on the left. Right.
Charlotte, can you kind of outline the, again, going back to your idea of the double helix in the Democratic Party, can you sort of outline, what you mean by that? And describe the party for us, I guess. Is it fair to say it's the radical left? Right. That seems to not sum it up.
So I think that Julie is absolutely right in her characterization of sort of like what won in 2018 and also what won in the 2020 primary. The way I look at it is kind of twofold. There's sort of like there's the Barack Obama style Democrat, who is a little bit more interested in working within the system, who's a little bit more interested in a sort of, you know, what probably opponents would call a technocratic approach to, you know, Obama was famous for saying, better is good. So, you know, incremental change, let's get the ACA, let's not push for, you know, Medicare for all, let's get what we can and continue to push on each of these issues. And I would put somebody like Pete Buttigieg in that category. I would also put a lot of the young women who did flip seats in 2018, like Lauren Underwood and Haley Stevens. I'm actually in Haley Stevens' district right now. You know, I think Julie's exactly right that there is often this kind of misnomer that like the next generation of Democrats is like AOC, Ilhan Omar. Actually, the next generation of Democrats is as much Pete Buttigieg as it is AOC, and it's as much Haley Stevens and Lauren Underwood as it is Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib. So I would put I would put those candidates in the sort of Obama bucket. In the book, I call it the fix the system Democrats. And then there's another style of Democrat, of new young Democrat, which comes more out of the sort of Occupy, Black Lives Matter, into the Bernie Sanders campaign, that mold of Democrat. They are typically less interested in incremental change. They are typically more interested in like broad structural reforms. And in the book, I call them the fuck the system Democrats. And then I got some calls from people being like, I was reading my book with my child and your book has the F word in it. And I was like, sorry.
Our book also has a lot of the F word in it, fortunately.
We have shithole countries, so. Yeah.
But we're quoting Trump, at least. So.
Yeah.
Well, I wasn't. So anyway, you have the fix the system and you have the fuck the system. And I think from what we saw in and I would put AOC and Ilhan Omar and even Bernie Sanders, who is himself not a millennial, but is certainly representing a lot of what this kind of new young left wants. He's their candidate, period. I mean, look at Elizabeth Warren's efforts to try to become their candidate. It didn't work. Like, they're all with Bernie. I would put them in the fuck the system category. And one of the things that I kind of came away with after reporting this book is that the people who are the Obama style Democrats are much better at winning elections in the electorate that we have now, on the map that we have now, 2018, 2020, 2022, 2024. We're going to continue to see a lot of Pete's and Haley's and Lauren's of the world. But
so you're saying presidential elections as well as midterms, right?
I think it is very hard. Like, as Julie pointed out correctly, like the candidates of the progressive left have flipped 0 seats from Republicans, right? So if we're talking about who's putting points on the board in terms of actually winning over in like conservative or swing districts, it's not the AOCs of the world.
Right.
But if we're talking about who is setting the agenda long term or introducing ideas into the electorate that could influence how people think about these issues for the next 10 or 20 years, that's where the AOCs and the Bernie Sanderses of the world have a lot of influence.
Right. You know, Nancy Pelosi got in so much trouble for saying, I forget, you know, that they don't have the numbers or the numbers aren't there. And, you know, she was telling the truth, right? Those were, the squad is 4 votes. It's not. So talk a little bit, maybe, I don't know which one of you wants to jump in, but what, we of course have down ballot races, and I'm not talking so much about state, but the Senate and the House. So talk a little bit, maybe Julie, you could talk about where the Times is looking for these races. Like, what races are you thinking are competitive? How many of these seats from 2018 have moved into the sort of, that did flip? How many of them are likely D? How many of them are still toss-ups 2 years later? What are you seeing?
Yeah, so I mean, I think in the beginning of the cycle, right, you know, in the beginning of 2019 at the start of the Congress, we all expected, and I think Democrats certainly expected, that they were going to be playing major defense in this election in terms of the map that they were able to be so successful on in 2018. This, you know, group of seats, it's about 24 seats that were Trump districts that got flipped blue, or, you know, they were Trump districts that Democrats won in 2018, that, they were going to be really on defense, trying to, fighting tooth and nail to protect them. I think the way things have turned out, given coronavirus crisis, given the recession, given Trump's low approval ratings, which, as we've seen, has sort of trickled down the ballot in a lot of, at least the surveys that we've seen, to Republican races. They're really not on defense in a lot of these places where they thought they would be. The suburbs, I think Republican operatives would acknowledge right now, are really still drifting away from Republicans, and far from sort of worrying about some of these districts going back toward the Republicans. The Democrats are actually reaching deeper into redder suburbs this time around and targeting seats like, in suburban Indiana, suburban Nebraska, suburban, the suburbs of St. Louis. Some of these places, I think the Republicans expected to be safe, and they're not. And some of the Democrats who won in 2018 in these marginal districts are really okay. Huh. The places, there are some of them that are going to be slogs. Social Small in Arizona has a real race. Abby Finkenauer in Iowa, I think everyone expects is going to have a race. I think Republicans are looking right now at trying to stem sort of some of the bleeding that they're seeing in the suburbs in more white working class rural areas. So I think we're going to see a real push on their part in places like Iowa, Pennsylvania, Maine, places like that. And what we may see happen is that Democrats are able to win some of these Republican suburban seats, and then Republicans are able to sort of offset that by winning some of those more white working class rural areas. But I think in terms of the House, I would be shocked if we saw a change in control, if the Republicans were able to reclaim control, and even if they were able to make a net gain of seats. I think the best that they are hoping for right now is that they can stem the bleeding, stop themselves from losing another sort of tier of races for 2018. In terms of the Senate, it's a very mixed picture. You have a lot of, very sort of on the bubble races. Republicans are really fighting in Arizona. Martha McSally, Cory Gardner in Colorado is having a lot of trouble. They're even having to defend incumbents in places like Alaska and Montana, again, which they thought were going to be safe. But I do think you have some races like in places like Maine, Susan Collins. I mean, she has been in the Senate for 4 terms. She is a formidable politician. She has, people in that state know her very well. And while there's a lot of, I think, grassroots anger on the left and in the middle against her, there's a lot of positive feeling toward her. So I think that's a real slog for Democrats. North Carolina is going to be in a place where Republicans are going to have to really fight to hold on. But I think, the Senate is going to be, as Mitch McConnell puts it these days, a knife fight. Again, a few months ago, I don't think we would have said that. I think we would have said, Democrats are going to have a really hard time making any inroads. And I wouldn't be surprised if they got, within striking distance. And we also may not know, Marcia talked about being kept up at night by what was going on in politics. But we may not know in January who holds the Senate, because you have 2 Senate elections in Georgia that may not be decided until after the first of the year. So,
and why is that? Is that a mail-in voting count?
No, it's not about mail-in voting. It's because of the rules of their election, that if there's a runoff, if one candidate doesn't get enough percentage of the vote, then there's a runoff. And so that would be then decided several months after.
Right. We had that in Louisiana several years ago,
yeah.
Right? Yeah,
yes.
Right. Okay. Interesting. Charlotte seems to have dropped out, but I was hoping to ask.
Oh, I'm here.
Oh, you're there. Okay, sorry, I can't see you. Okay, so I'm going to speak.
I see you.
But so 2 things. One, Julie mentioned Maine, and I do think Susan Collins is just really popular, and that's a case. It's sort of like Teddy Kennedy was in Massachusetts for a long time. Like people hated him, but they kept voting him because of seniority, and they knew he was effective. And in Susan's case, she's fairly moderate, which speaks to the state. But, we have seen a lot of Trump energy in Maine. I've just been reading stories about that. But I also noticed that one of our colleagues tweeted out a picture of a sign from Western Pennsylvania recently that said, something like, you know, it's okay to vote for Biden. Like, and I wonder, you know, like how much, I think in 2016, there was this silent Trump vote, right? Like people didn't want to admit that they were voting for Trump, but they did. Now are we seeing people who don't want to admit they're voting for Biden? Like, where are we on this? Where is the, and I guess, you know, Charlotte, if you're, I'm very curious about Western Pennsylvania. Like, where is that now?
Yeah, so I'm not getting to Western Pennsylvania until early next week. So I can't comment on that in particular, but I certainly in Wisconsin and Michigan so far have seen like very loud and proud Trump support. I mean, people, I was in a Kroger's parking lot today for a couple hours, and there was a guy with a huge Trump sign that said, "No more bullshit," but there was no spaces in between any of the words. So it was just no more bullshit. And so I'm seeing very loud and proud Trump support. A lot of the Biden supporters I am talking to are weak Biden supporters. They're sort of, maybe I'll vote for him, maybe not. And you know, I definitely think that if Biden does pull it off, it will be a silent majority situation for him. I want to go back to what.
Sorry, for Biden.
For him, yeah, if he does win, which I don't know, but the feel out here is very. The Trump supporters are very enthusiastic, and there is a level I think that an undertone I'm hearing in some of my conversations with the Trump supporters are very like, you know, kind of screw you, I'm proud of it. Like that's the undertone of, whereas when I was doing similar reporting in 2016, people were more reserved about saying to a reporter that they were voting for Trump. Now, I was, you know, literally this morning, I was talking to a woman in the parking lot, and a guy in a Trump shirt drove by and sort of said, you know, "You didn't talk to me because I was wearing a Trump shirt." And that's not true. Like, I talked to many Trump supporters. I was just in the middle of a conversation with another person when he was coming up. That's why I didn't go talk to him. But there's a lot of, yeah, there's a lot of like sort of crowd rage.
Yeah.
But I want to say something about the down ballot races, which I think is really important. And, you know, nobody knows more about like the balance of power in the House and Senate than Julie. So I agree with everything she said.
I don't know if that's true, though. I think some people know more about it.
Well, you definitely know a lot. But one thing I think that a lot of people miss, particularly in this election, is the importance of state house races, state house and state Senate races, both for the long-term health of a party like the Democratic Party, which has neglected these state house and state Senate races for so long. You know, for example, Sarah Gideon, who's running against Susan Collins in Maine, she came from the Maine State House. These state legislatures are absolutely kind of where both parties grow their bench of talent. And Democrats, until 2018, had been really neglecting them for like a decade. So I think we're seeing this renewed interest in those state and local races. And, you know, I hear from people all the time, Democrats say, "Oh my God, I'm so upset. What's going on? Trump, like, you know, what do I do?" And the thing, I can't tell anybody what to do, but I do think that if you are, that focusing on state and local races is the best way to get the most impact for whatever you're doing. Because a lot of these races, their budgets are tiny. They are doing a tremendous amount of work up ballot. And particularly now when Joe Biden has very little ground game because of the coronavirus, he's running his campaign almost entirely online. So there are not people who are walking around knocking on doors with the Joe Biden campaign trying to get people to vote for Joe Biden. His campaign has shifted to an almost entirely digital operation. The people who are doing that work of going out and knocking on doors and getting voters are these state and local races. These state and local candidates who are already there. They already know their district. They already know their neighbors. They have a small portion of whatever county and whatever district that they're in charge of, and they are pounding the pavement. So one thing that I think is one reason that in my book I focused on these, you know, not only congressional candidates, but also, you know, a state senator, a city councilman, is that I think one of the things that has happened in American politics over the last, I don't know how long, decade or so, is that people are obsessed with the presidency as the only, like, kind of, as the only political office. And they're kind of like, well, Trump's up here, Biden's up there, blah. And I actually think that the health of these that these state legislatures and state senates have so much more power than people give them credit for, particularly on election issues. They're the places where a lot of, you know, somebody calls them the laboratories of democracy. I'm going to forget who said that.
Just state legislatures, yeah.
Yes, yeah. And people just totally ignore them. And I can't tell you how many people are like so plugged into politics and they know everything that Trump said and everything that Mitch McConnell says, even though they don't live in Kentucky, and they don't know who their state rep or state senator is. So that would just be kind of like my plug when we're talking about down ballot races. There's an operative who has this term for it, reverse coattails theory, which is like, you know, people like to think that, you know, voters come out and vote for who's ever at the top of the ticket. And then they're like, okay, well, I'm here to vote for Trump and then I'll vote for all the Republicans down ballot. And that certainly does happen. But also the other thing can happen, which is that, let's say, you know, let's use Sarah Gideon since she's somebody that people know, right? But let's say we're talking about Sarah Gideon 5 years ago, 4 years ago, something like that. If Sarah Gideon is pounding the pavement in her small district and she has gone to these houses and she knows the people's dogs and she knows that so-and-so's daughter is going to lacrosse camp and she knows that, oh, like, wow, your flowers look so much better than they did last time they were here. You know, somebody who, you know, a voter in her district who doesn't really care who's at the top of the ticket and doesn't really care about the House race maybe, but really likes that nice lady, Sarah Gideon, who keeps coming around. She might show up to vote that year, to vote for her friend, Sarah Gideon, and then while she's there, she might vote for Democrats up the ticket. So,
right, and their operations are also powerful, get out the vote operations. Yeah, I agree.
Especially
I do think, I mean, I feel like, Julie, you and I both covered Congress in 2006. I feel like that race, I was very aware that year of, I felt like the public had kind of recognized that it wasn't enough to have, that one way they could push back against Bush was to have the House and Senate on their side. I felt like that was when people, but I do think you're right, Charlotte, about state legislatures, particularly right with redistricting, because it's a census group. So that's, it's a huge issue. I do want to go, please everyone ask your questions. I want to go to a couple that we've had so far. Julie, since you're there, you're joining us from Florida. There is a question about Florida and swing states. So I know you said you look out your window and you see Trump flags. What is your sense? Not trying to push you into prognosis, but what do you think about Florida?
I mean, Florida is always like very hard fought. I feel like it's a very 50-50 place. I will say that on my way to where I am in Florida, which is on the west coast of Florida, we saw a lot of the loud and proud that Charlotte is talking about, like giant Trump 2020 signs on the highway. As you said, my neighbor here is flying a Trump 4 more years flag, just, you know, sort of randomly on a regular basis. You know, but the demographics of this state are powerful and they've changed a lot. And so that's where I think, you know, in 2018, we did see Democrats make a lot of inroads in congressional seats. And I think it's going to be a slog for both parties. So, I mean, I think Florida continues to be, you know, hotly contested. But I also think that because there is no Senate race here, you know, there's a little bit less. I mean, clearly the presidential campaigns are, you know, very focused on what happens here, but there's a little bit less attention to what's happening in this state. I think really the places where, you know, Trump and the Biden campaign are focusing the most are places like Wisconsin, Minnesota, you mentioned Pennsylvania, that can be more determinative. Like if you look at the way the map was in 2016, there are certain, you know, if everything stayed the same, there are certain states that can really make the difference. And I don't necessarily think Florida is one of them. So, you know, I think, you know, it will once again be one of these very on the bubble places, but I don't know that I think that it's going to end up making the definitive difference, at least in the presidential.
Interesting. Okay. Huh. We also had a question. This is sort of an interesting one. Charlotte, maybe you want to answer this, or anybody jump in. How much do policy differences matter? Do people really care about the policy differences between progressive and moderate Democrats? Or is it more about the language and emotions that different factions appeal to? What do you think? Looking for the word.
So I think that some people obviously really care about the difference between progressive and moderate Democrats. I don't think that the people who care about those differences are the people who decide the election.
Right.
So there are certainly let me be clear, a presidential election. Certainly that is something that, certainly the distinction between a candidate who supports the Green New Deal and a candidate who is less progressive than that certainly made a huge difference in Ed Markey's race for the Senate. Mm-hmm. So in some of these deep blue districts, those distinctions matter a ton, or deep blue states, those distinctions matter a lot. And I wouldn't be surprised if over the next couple of years in places like New York and California and Massachusetts, if we start seeing more Senate candidates, more governor candidates who are really kind of moving to the left according to where the progressive left is. I wish that I had the words to describe how little the voters that I met in Wisconsin and Michigan care about this. They
care about policy.
Care about policy, care about the reports that the president called fallen war dead losers and suffers, care about the Bob Woodward tape that came out, care about the Politico report about the CDC, potentially meddling with coronavirus data. I think that there is, in some ways, an expectation among people who think a lot about this, that everybody thinks a lot about this, that people think that I'm going to go to a parking lot and meet a voter who's like, well, I was undecided, but then I heard the Bob Woodward tape, and that's not good, and I'm voting for Joe Biden. No, that voter doesn't exist, or at least I haven't met them. I'm sure maybe all types of voters exist. So I don't think that these, kind of very specific policy distinctions are landing in the places that Joe Biden needs to win.
Right. I think
if I could just jump in there, I was going to say, I found this in in reporting the book and then covering the Trump White House, that whenever I would go to a Trump rally and cover, and talk to people, almost invariably, I don't want to get too scientific because I wasn't being scientific, but 3/4 of people or 80% of people, when I would say, what do you like the best about Trump? They would say something about the wall or immigration.
Wow.
Huh. And if you asked a follow-up question that was a policy question, well, why? Or do you think that too many people, there was nothing there. It was not a policy thing. It was an emotional thing. Yeah. It was well, I just like that he says it and it makes me scared and he's right and no one's been willing to say it. And, I would try and I would really want to understand where this was coming from. Are there people in your community who are scary to you? It was none of that. It was just a very visceral, emotional thing. And I think that is really what moves people, frankly, on both sides of the aisle. And I think that that is what ends up being determinative. And for those of us who care about policy and like to write about it and try to figure out what people are thinking about it, it can be deeply unsatisfying, because that in primaries, that is clearly the driving factor. In general elections, I just think it's very far down on anyone's radar screen.
Yeah. I think it was a couple years ago, Stan Greenberg, a pollster who you talk about in your book, Democratic pollster, he wrote this great op-ed that was everyone thinks these undecided voters are well, on the one hand and on the other hand, and that they're doing this, as you say, almost scientifically. And they're really not that thoughtful. They're kind of showing up at the booth and going, well, my neighbor says this person, so I'm going to vote for that person. But on that note, Charlotte, when you're talking to voters, or Julie, maybe you have a sense this seems like such a polarized time. Is there such a thing as undecided voters at this point? It always kind of shocks me that we get into September and October, especially in a year like this, and there are. But tell me what you're hearing.
So It is certainly deeply polarized, and I am not meeting many undecided voters. I am meeting a couple. I just met a woman this morning who her fiance is in the military, and so she doesn't like that the president uses the military as pawns, you know, or that those are her words, not mine. And she didn't like the losers and suckers comment. And there are a lot of things she doesn't like about the president. The thing that I'm hearing that, you know, I think would be worrisome to the Biden team and to Democrats is that I'm hearing a lot of people who say some version of, I don't like Trump. He's, you know, he sucks for this reason. I don't like that thing that he did, but I don't know about Joe Biden. You know, I think that there is an assumption that disliking Trump is going to automatically translate into a vote for Joe Biden. And I have heard from enough people who are sort of ambivalent about Joe Biden that I don't know that that is as sure of a thing as the campaign seems to think it is.
And to those people, is the risk that those people just stay home instead of voting at all?
Yeah. I mean, I don't think that this woman that I spoke to, I would be surprised if she voted for Trump. Then again, one of the things that keeps coming back to me as I do these interviews is that like things turn on a dime. So for example, I've had many conversations with people where it starts off, you know, they are a suburban woman in yoga pants or something. Like, you know, there's a certain amount that you can kind of deduce from looking at a voter. If somebody's wearing an NRA hat, you sort of kind of know what, you know, but, you know, sometimes I have been surprised at how often I've been surprised. I've talked to people where they're a suburban woman, you know, wearing yoga pants, and they say something like, you know, I hate how divided this country is. I just want everyone to get along. I just want a president who can bring people together. I want the country to be healed. And that's why I'm voting for Donald Trump again. So it's like, there is not a, based on the previous statements that she said, you would think that this voter would be going with Joe Biden, whose message is restore the soul of the nation. But there's an interruption in the logic for a lot of the voters, and it can go both ways. But it makes me think that a lot of the assumptions about why voters behave the way they behave have some flaws in them.
Right. Another question that we just got, which, dropping my phone, is and Julie, maybe you can talk to this because you do deal with the onslaught. It just seems like there are 5 different, you know, hits or stories a day. So this is the question: is all the recent bad press about Trump affecting his chances, or is that just wishful thinking on the part of the Democrats? Are Republicans getting tired of him? And maybe are Republicans getting tired, just to put my own spin on this, of this feeling of chaos around him? You know, there's just like they're constantly having to defend him.
I mean, I think there is no question for any of us who talk to Republicans on a regular basis and talk to their aides, they have long since gotten tired of him, most of them. They would never say that publicly because they know that that would be fatal for them politically. They are all dependent on the support of the Republican base, on which we all know by now Trump has like an iron grip. So, you know, it'd be political suicide for them to ever acknowledge that they are tired of him and that they wish that they had a president who, you know, did not require them every 24 hours to have another news cycle of like, what do you think about Trump saying that, you know, fallen military heroes are suckers and losers? And like, what do you think of the fact that Trump, you know, said he wanted to downplay the coronavirus? And, you know, they're long since tired of that. And I also think that they're, you know, many of them are tired of, you know, having basically just sort of the lack of a cohesive message. Like they like to think of themselves as a party with some principles. Not all of them, but you know, there are many elected Republicans in Congress who like to think of themselves and who spent their careers, you know, trying to sort of organize themselves around certain ideological principles and party principles and appeal to voters on that basis and be public servants on that basis. And I think they feel like it's impossible to do that with Trump in the White House because he doesn't really believe in any of it. And he makes it hard for them to kind of defend the positions that they take. That said, I think that they realize that he is a huge base motivator and net positive for anyone who needs to really depend on Republican voters and their energy and turnout. So I think that that is, I don't think we should expect to see, I mean, our editors and many of our readers have been asking for, you know, since Trump was elected, basically, like, what is going to be the breaking point? Like, what's going to be the thing that's going to be like, okay, now this is too much. And like, that thing does not exist. Like, there is no such thing. We've had, you know, millions of news cycles. You know, we've got the Woodward book now. We've got the coronavirus revelations. When our book came out and we had, you know, these details about how he wanted to have an electrified wall with alligators and snakes in the moat, you know, people just kept on saying, like, is this going to be the thing? Is this going to be the thing? No, it's not. Like, his base is with him, and beyond the base, like the Republican Party is willing to tolerate these things from him. It just is. I mean, that we have seen that again and again over the past 4 years. So I think that Charlotte is really right, that if people think that that is going to materially change kind of the bent of the electorate, they're wrong. Now, I will say that I think that what we saw in 2018 in some of these congressional races, when again, Trump was not on the ballot, so we have to factor that in, and he is on the ballot this year. So it's a different environment. But I think we did see that a lot of independent voters and Republican-leaning voters who they don't consider themselves like dyed-in-the-wool Republicans, but like have voted Republican for a long time, were very turned off by some of this rhetoric and by some of these positions that Trump was taking, and that they assumed, based on the R after the name, that members of Congress who were Republicans also agreed with. And it resulted in a bloodbath for Republicans in the House. Right. It did not result in a bloodbath, however, for Republicans in the Senate. So, you know, when you look at it in a more statewide manner, I don't know how much it's necessarily going to influence things. So I'm not saying it's not going to have any bearing, but I think that people, particularly those of us who tend to cover every little twist of the screw, tend to overestimate the impact that these things are going to have on voters.
So this actually sets us up interestingly, and please, everyone, we're heading toward the end of our session, so do ask your questions now. But here's an interesting question about someone who says, I do voter persuasion a lot, and I often use a tactic of meeting the voters, on their issues. It works better and it may get them to vote the way I want. However, it does not do anything to change the value system people use to decide how they vote. Should I give up on this during election time? What do we do about people being unfazed about threats to peaceful transitions of power and secure elections? Same thing regarding racial equality. Conservative voters, I know, don't really care about it, but what can we do to get people to care? So I guess this sort of speaks to this, I don't know, sort of sense of hopelessness around people. Like, what's the sort of prospect for, as I said at the beginning, you write about sort of the poles of our political discourse. Like, what's the possibility for people who do want to meet in the middle, I mean, going forward? Or in terms of, like, are voters just pushed in their positions and there's no use talking to them? Or what do you think, Charlotte? What are you hearing?
Well, one of the things, I wrote a piece about this earlier this week, but one of the things that has been frankly chilling to me is the number of conspiracy theories that I'm hearing in ordinary conversations from ordinary people in ordinary places. Not at Trump rallies, which I heard them at Trump rallies all the time in 2016. Now I'm hearing them in grocery store parking lots. So that's scary. And one of the things that we know particularly about a conspiracy theory is that, you know, efforts to provide facts that disprove a conspiracy theory only end up reinforcing a conspiracy theory. So for people who believe, like, that the moon landing was faked, right? If you say to them, no, look, NASA has this picture of Neil Armstrong on the moon, they say, see, NASA's in on it. And then if you say, no, look, you know, Buzz Aldrin's wife has this rock from the moon that he gave her, they say, no, but Buzz Aldrin's wife is being paid off. Like, you know, it's like there is no information. when they have a worldview that believes that there is a conspiracy of some kind, like
just talking them out of it,
right? Which is why, and this is one place that I actually think, for example, I agree that the sort of young left has not been particularly good in terms of actually like flipping seats for Democrats. But one thing that I think they do understand is that, the way for Democrats in particular to win more voters is not really to persuade the QAnon people to change their minds, right, or the hardcore Trump people to change their minds. It's to persuade the people the 40% of Americans who don't vote and don't care, to get involved in the political system. To vote. Yeah, right. So, activists on the left like to say that their swing voters are not Trump to Democrat, it's non-voter to voter. And that is in some ways an easier way, an easier argument to make. It's easier to convince somebody to go from not caring about politics to caring about politics than it is to convince somebody who is a hardcore conservative that they should be a hardcore liberal. Right.
Okay, so one last question for both of you. Julie, we'll start with you, but it's the same question. So how many days out from Election Day I know you don't want to get in prognosis, but do you think we're going to know a week out? Or are we going to be still wondering at Christmas, New Year's Eve? I mean, when are we going to know?
I mean, I would be shocked at this point if we knew on election night. I would like to think that within a week we will know.
Yeah.
At least on congressional races. I mean, I would be surprised if we didn't at least have some sort of a result, be it disputed or not. And I expect it would be disputed by the weekend after. Yep. I mean, I think there's an immense amount of energy right now being put into, at least on the Democratic side. And I actually think on the Republican side too, but they have the problem of Trump constantly talking about how mail-in voting is fake and fraudulent. But I think both parties, like if you talk to the actual people who are doing the work of like voter turnout and organizing and stuff like that, are trying really hard to get people to like figure out how they're going to vote, when they're going to vote, and when they can vote early, have them vote early. But I mean, listen, I just think that given what we've seen with the post office, given the huge uptick that we're expecting to see in mail-in ballots, given the pandemic, we're just not going to know right then. And I think everyone has to kind of bake that into the assumption that it's going to be a nightmare for those of us who are supposed to be like having a front page story the next day saying what happened.
Right, exactly. So Charlotte, what about you? What states are you watching most closely going into election?
Well, I'm definitely watching Wisconsin. Well, okay. So for example, Michigan is a state I'm watching closely because I think that Democrats, won big here in 2018. They left these liberal women up and down the ballot. And if Michigan doesn't go for Biden, he's in trouble in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin. Michigan, I think last time, and Julie, tell me if you disagree, I think last time for a lot of people who were watching the returns, Virginia being close was a sign that things were not going. Yeah, it was sort of an early like canary in the coal mine that the election night was not going as promised. So not promised, but as everyone anticipated. Yeah. So I think that Michigan is the state that I'm watching because I think if Biden doesn't win here, I don't know how he wins the election.
Right. Wow.
But honestly, not to end on a scary note, but it feels chaotic.
Wow.
There's a deep sense of chaos. And I feel like in a lot of ways, this election isn't really about Republicans versus Democrats. It's sort of about order versus chaos. And I kind of think chaos is winning.
On that note, buckle our seatbelts. Thank you both for joining. Please, everyone, go to the button where it says, I'm going to reintroduce Marcia, who will wrap up. But again, green button, buy the author's books. They're really fun, incredibly fast-paced, exciting books, and I urge you to read them both. Thank you, Julie. Thank you, Charlotte. It's been really fun.
Thanks for having us. Great.
And a big thank you to all three of you for an informative, fascinating, and at times disturbing conversation. Thanks again. I want to remind our viewers to not only buy the books, but also consider donating to Succeed Together so we can continue to offer free online tutoring and enrichment classes to low-income families in Essex County. We want to give a special thanks to our festival sponsors, event partners, festival friends, volunteers, and staff, as well as everyone who has helped us to produce our festival events. We have one more event coming up today at 5 p.m., Picturepalooza, or Picture Book Idea, which is one of our most popular events every year, and two very popular sessions tomorrow, a virtual brunch with food critic Adam Platt at 11 a.m., as well as Christine Baker Klein's new book launch, The Exiles, with the Montclair Library at 4 p.m. tomorrow. Take a look at our Crowdcast channel to sign up. I want to thank you all, and don't forget to vote, please.